Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Expat Lens. I'm glad to see you. On today's episode, my guest and I go into the details of what it's actually like to live in Japan for over a decade. This episode is jam-packed with a lot of insightful analysis on Japanese culture and the challenges we face as foreigners trying to fit into that culture. We also touch upon how being an expat for so long changes the way you see the world, the way you see your home culture, and the way you see yourself. If any of that piques your interest, please stick around and take a look through the Expat Lens. Hello and welcome to Expat Lens. I'm your host, Jack Xavier. Today on the podcast, it brings me great pleasure to welcome a close personal friend of mine. He is a master of karate and friendship. Hi, Dan. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Let's jump into things. What originally brought you to Japan? What was that inciting incident?
We're already in it.
We're jumping in.
We're jumping in. Okay. Yeah, man. All right. So the super short story is I've done martial arts for basically the good portion of my life. I used to compete at the international level for karate specifically. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I am Daniel-san at the end of the day. You know how many people have like just gone through my life and been like, oh, what's that? And they and then they did some kung fu move or said the word judo chop. And I was just like, yeah, because there's chops in judo. Exactly. Right. So yeah, no. So I did that. I started that when I was 9. I wanted to do that well before I was 9. I just couldn't because there was no martial arts school around where I used to. I lived in I was born in Arkansas and I lived in Indiana, and it was like from 4 to 8. 4 to 8 is when I wanted to do that, but nothing around. So I took up swimming, and I was like state champ swimming so I was like, okay, but we finally moved. My dad got a different job, moved to Pennsylvania, and that's where I really kind of identify like where where I've been from, kind of thing. And there was a dojo there, and it was like, okay, I can finally go and do this thing. That's how that all started. Skip way, way, way forward. Okay, I'm competing internationally, like globally, like U.S. This is like U.S. team. There was an organization called the Amateur Athletic Union in America, and this is all the sports, right? All the major sports, and so I got on the team there. Did some junior Olympic stuff. By the way, karate was never in the Olympics when I was in my prime years. So it's a very interesting thing that was just in the past Olympics here, right, and likely never will be again, which is a bit of a bittersweet thing. Yeah. So I got here. First time I came was in 2002, and I was 15 at the time. So that was my first real exposure to Japan, and been literally like a dream to like come here and like, you know, the progression up through martial arts and like all this kind of stuff. Right. So it's just been, I remember it's kind of funny because I live in the exact area that I first came to when I came with the team. So the Shinagawa area. Sure. So, you know, that bus that goes from Narita Airport straight in, we took that, you know, all that. Shinagawa is basically unchanged since then. It's still stuck in like 1995. Like it was just that whole experience of the hotels, and I'm from a super, super small town in like, it's suburban rural Pennsylvania. And for the people that don't know Pennsylvania, it's like farmland everywhere, rolling hills and just a lot of green. There's cows and all these kind of things. And then every once in a while, there's like pockets of people, you know, kind of thing. So going from that to biggest city in the world, it's like there's that shock factor, and it's just a lot of open mouth, you know, looking around with big dinner plate eyes and like stuff like that. And you're 15 too, man. So you're just like, okay, there's all this stuff to take in.
So you said, okay, you first got interested in karate when you were around 4 to 8 years old, but you didn't have the like opportunity to do that. So you went into swimming instead for the time being. 4 years old is really young. to start thinking about like karate? Why? Like where?
Oh,
how?
dude, it's definitely like some Power Rangers or something like that. I don't have like, nah. I just saw a lot of jump kicking and back flipping and that kind of stuff on TV and whatnot. So, yeah, I just gravitated toward that. And I'm an only child, right? So I was a very in my head kind of kid, but I was also very active, not like hyper, but I like doing things. And so I always tried to keep myself entertained. So I thought that was and that was something that I'm not thinking of this as like as a 4-year-old as like, oh, what kind of equipment do I need and stuff. But I'm just like, you don't need anything to do that, right? You need yourself.
Right.
Right. And so I think that was an appeal there. I think it's also another reason I kind of took on swimming too, was because, there's some water. Just got to go jump in that, get to the other side. Like that's it.
Nice.
So,
and okay, so you went, how long did you stay the first time you came?
2 weeks. Yeah.
What were your other impressions? Your image of Japan before you came here, and like what you thought it was like, and then when you actually came here and you had that big impression, you mentioned how big the city is and everything.
I think before I came, I didn't have too many expectations actually. I was hoping that it was going to be just like the city itself, it was going to be glittery and it was going to be impressive. But that wasn't the allure for Japan for me to begin with. It was definitely like the traditional side, the culture of respect and high attention to detail, and just because of the martial arts connection to me. Like I was looking at it through a martial arts lens for sure.
Sure.
So like I was wondering how much of that was true and how much of that I was actually going to get to experience. That was the main thing. After I came from those 2 weeks, right? Because the trip was very, like, we did a lot of like sightseeing in between the tournament and things like that, which was really great. I actually we went to like Kanazawa, Osaka, and then Hakone actually. Yeah. So we did a pretty decent amount of travel. So we got to, and especially Kanazawa, because Kanazawa at that time particularly, there was no big station like there is now. So that was still quite rural in those days. And we went to train there actually.
Cool.
This was in March when I was in there, in the mountains in March. We trained on these super hard tatami mats. It's like bricks. It was, oh man. And that I remember that training to this day. That was tough. That was a tough one.
So it met your expectations, basically.
That part of it definitely met my expectations. I was like, yo, we in the mountains. We're training in Japan. It is snowing outside. I am freezing. Like that kind of thing. I was just like, yeah, that was cool. But yeah, getting to see like what the city was, and then like traveling in between and engaging with the people. That was like the place where I lost my passport. And I left it on a bus.
Oh.
We were coming from Osaka back to Tokyo, and there was a businessman that found it, and he came all the way back himself, not like his company or anything like that. He came himself and said, hey, I found this. And of course the coaches like were super pissed off at me. They literally made me come out and like bow 1,000 times to him.
Wow.
I mean, talk about being lucky, right? But
there's your representation of like the respect and the attention to detail and everything, right? Like that is a story that we've heard like many times, something like this in Japan, right?
Exactly.
And it feels unbelievable, especially coming from the States or like the West.
Anywhere really. Yeah.
and then like you have this experience and like, wow, that's amazing. Like this guy's so nice. And it's like, well, almost everyone has had an experience like that in Japan. It's so crazy.
Yeah, it is. It is. You've had this too, yeah?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like, drop my phone or drop my wallet on the train, and then the train goes to the end of the line and someone picks it up and gives it to the station master, and then they call you or someone else, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, we have it. Yep, everything's here. Come get it. Oh, thanks.
Yeah, you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Like, there's no thought of like, where's the money of all the credit cards been maxed out, and all this stuff. Yeah, it's wild. So, so that experience, that was like the immediate impression after that trip. So, yeah, I think if you were to ask me now of like, what's my impression of Japan and like, how do I view it? I mean, completely different. So,
what would you say the biggest difference is between that initial like tradition, respect, and attention to detail versus okay, it's been, but this is year 15, 16 for you?
Coming up on 15 next year, yeah.
What's the big change? What have you noticed? I mean, we can talk about positive and negative things, or neutral things, whatever, right? Like the longer you stay here, the more I tend to hear some negative aspects as well, which look, that's the truth, right? Japan is a great country. I love it. I love living here, but eventually there are some things about it that will come to annoy you, just like any other country.
Exactly.
And I think it's as important to talk about those things in truth as to talk about the great stuff as well. So.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that's well said. Because I wouldn't be here as long as I have if I didn't enjoy it, right? So I think the biggest, to speak more neutrally about it, it's like all of the cultural things that I was either willfully ignorant of, or that I just didn't pay attention to because either the language wasn't sufficient enough for me to understand, or my experience was kind of isolated. So just like everything else, time is the best teacher, right? So to give some examples of this is like, I think that the one thing I've always heard every single non-Japanese person that's visited Japan is like, everyone is so nice. I was like, everyone is very outwardly cordial is the best way for me to describe it.
That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. Inside, not even behind closed doors. I think that's the one thing I would amend. It's not, of course, behind closed doors, every human is going to act a different way.
Yeah.
But here it is in certain situations. It's not even certain places, certain social situations. So Japan, extremely hierarchical Confucian society, whether they'll admit it or not on the Confucian side. But it is. And because of this senior, junior, male, female, experienced versus non-experienced person just being ingrained into society at all levels, that critical, discriminatory part of the culture is ever present. And the culture has done an exceptionally well job of masking that to the outside.
Yeah, and I would agree.
And I think that's a very big reason of why you can come here with no experience, just glimpse and go, wow, people are just holistically really nice. And they are, actually. People are good-hearted people here, I would say, relative to a lot of other places.
I'd agree, yeah.
Yeah. But in which is a pretty interesting dichotomy of social behavior, right? The propensity to feel suppressed, like individually emotionally suppressed at times, and the guilt that's laid on. I think that's the one thing, Jack, that I would say is that I've realized that the guilt that is laid on individuals and also groups for what I think Western societies would deem as completely unreasonable and at times mental abuse is the common practice for social conformity here.
I want to jump in with just a little idea there that I think helps to illustrate this. So there's the concept of sexual harassment, sekuhara, right? Power harassment, pawahara. And then there's something called harahara.
Oh, harahara. Oh, okay.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
which when I first heard that, I'm like,
yeah.
Excuse me? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
But it's like, okay, sexual harassment, power harassment, we don't really need to explain those things. What the hell is harassment? Harassment is the idea that someone is taking advantage of the position of being potentially harassed and then reverse harassing someone in a position of power. What?
Yeah. Yeah.
And okay, maybe this is a thing. Maybe it could very, very much so be a thing. I think it does illustrate what you said earlier, this level of hierarchical society,
Yes.
right? Maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I feel like
Oh, by the way, I mean, your job now is in like human resources, right? So maybe this is your wheelhouse. I didn't even think about that when I just picked it up.
Yeah, I'll leave my job aside, but just to make it more anecdotal, is I think that, and what I want to say from like the point that I don't think I really fleshed out the last point concisely, is to say that the culture of being very kind, warm-hearted, selfless is very true. How much of that runs juxtaposed to the imposed social behavior and conformity that is literally expected of all native people to hear, is such an interesting dichotomy. And it's like a society that has literally agreed this is precisely how you should behave in every circumstance. It's like your life is pre-planned here, and as long as you follow the structure, it's good. It's good. And if you're, and I think this is why Japan has such a high allure and keeps certain kinds of people.
Okay.
Especially if they're not Japanese. Like, obviously Japanese people,
sure,
they don't think about this probably as much as we non-Japanese people would. But I think that's the surprising thing to a lot of non-Japanese people that meet other non-Japanese people who have been here for an exorbitant amount of time. They're like, what has kept you here so long? And I think the answer that I don't hear a lot of non-Japanese people say that are super tenured is they don't talk about this thing of how their personality and their values have meshed with the social requirements of the country.
That's a good way of putting it. What do you think that would be then? Just your ability to kind of pick up on these nonverbal cues, or like be able to be flexible and, well, really actually conform a little bit to the Japanese way of doing things. Anything else?
I mean, at the core, conformity is a requirement because it's what the society is based on relative to Western society, which is individual first, right?
Right.
So you must be prepared to do that at some level. I think the other thing too is that, kind of along with the conformity, you have to be the kind of person that is very good at following directions without questioning. And again, like all the things that East and West represent individually, and then to clash in the middle, that's why it's chaotic. And that's why they tend to stay kind of in their own lanes. So the people that can traverse those and also then live in both, I think is a pretty interesting, it's an interesting life to live.
Yeah. This kind of reminds me of this idea of the gaijin smash, or the gaijin advantage, right? Foreigners who come to Japan either knowingly or unknowingly will break the rules in such a way that is, from a Japanese person's perspective, just kind of like unthinkable. Gaijin smashing, right?
Sure.
And you can definitely use this to your advantage if you wanted to, right? Oops, sorry, I didn't know. I broke the rules, but I don't care. Versus the gaijin advantage of being like, well, they don't know, and they could never know what it's like to be a Japanese person, so we're just going to give you a free pass. I think that's a good point to kind of pivot the conversation a little bit towards the idea of identity. And what I wanted to ask you about here was, I've been thinking about this question myself a really long time. Like, how do you see yourself as an American? Right? How did your idea of what it means to be an American change and become influenced because of Japan? Right? Like, that's a thing for sure, right? Yeah. The Japanese image of what an American should be. And because we're in this society where you're expected to kind of conform, do you think that you've changed the way that you act as a quote-unquote American to meet the Japanese expectation of that image at all? I'm going to throw on a little bit more there, and I'm sorry, this is a lot, but like,
I got you.
What do you also think it means to be Japanese?
Ooh, wow. Okay.
Right?
That's an interesting one.
And Yeah, we can split those two up.
I was
First,
gonna
let's
s- yeah.
focus on the American side, and then we can
Sure.
talk about what it means to be a Japanese person afterwards.
All right. Ooh, great questions.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, well done. Okay, so I had never thought what it meant to be an American until I moved here,
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
right? And I think it wasn't even out of necessity. There was just so many things. Like I knew before I came here, and then immediately after I had visited here, like the several times, that I could not. I had to assess my own culture in a certain way simply because of the engagements I was having. I had never had specific engagements before, and it made me like think about stuff.
For example,
The classic thing that I think anyone would, the reconfirmation of information that you've just explained.
okay.
It's like I go to a place and I say, "Hey, I would like this size of a T-shirt. Will you please go check it for me?" And they're like, "Okay, so you like a T-shirt?" And I'm like, "Excuse," I'm like, like in my head, I'm like, I was like, "Wait, did she not hear me? Why would you?" I definitely said it really clearly. It's like, yes, I would like a T-shirt. They're like, "Okay, let me go get it." Like, wait, so you did hear me? Hold on a second. And then they come back, and then they're like, "Okay, so you wanted this T-shirt in this size." So like we're on swing number 2 of this now, right? And I'm just like, is there someone else I should be speaking to? Is she okay? Like, like it's like I never had that experience, and then to have it ubiquitously.
I can add on to that something that happened to me yesterday, which kind of made me do the same double take. And this is like, okay, right? Been here 12, 13 years or something. Still happens, people. I was at the local city office or the ward office, whatever you call it. I need to print out some paperwork. And you can do it like face to face, right? But you can also do it with a machine with your My Number card, right? Which is basically the Social Security of Japan. And on the computer screen, it says something like start printing process. So you press the start printing process button, and then another window pops up and it says, do you want to start the printing process? Yes or no? I'm like, am I taking crazy pills? I literally just pressed the button that says start the printing process.
Just put that meme in there of like Zoolander. It's like, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills here.
Exactly. So yeah, it's definitely a thing. I guess it stems from just being taught to that confirming information and making sure that you have everything correct. And like, it's probably rooted in good service, right? Like that's what I would assume. But what do you think?
There's this idea. I definitely need to answer your question because I'm going to tangent here pretty hard. So keep me honest.
Okay.
Is also the one thing, if I can't remember the name of that. I can't remember the name of that thing, but it's basically a triangle, and they did this study of like all the countries in the world and culturally where they stand on this scale.
Okay.
And some of them are more conformist, some of them are more individual.
Interesting.
Right. And then where they intersect is where these like, hybrid cultures exist. So like, so Japan, Germany, and where's another one?
Like Singapore.
Yeah, Singapore. All the countries that are very rule bound, step by step, groupthink, must have a clear, definitive answer before a process begins. It's by no surprise that those places, they have all these procedural things in place. Right. Whereas then you get to the other side, more like the British, the Americans, Brazilians, a lot of South America in there, Vietnam even, in Asia. Way more, okay, well, we have some information, we're going to go with this. And we'll adjust on the fly where we kind of need to. Everyone's kind of okay with that. The forever adjustment as opposed to all the intense planning, right? So you can imagine how these would be like oil and water, right? So to go back to the Japan part of like, I really cannot think of another. Germany has got to be the closest culture to this, which it makes sense historically why they've kind of been allies in terms of culture.
Sure.
Literally just in terms of culture. Process driven with lots of checkpoints to ensure that a specific desired result will occur.
Sure.
Right. That process can get super mundane and almost to the point of illogical insanity because it's just like, I literally just said the thing that you're asking me. Are you sure? It's like, no, I wouldn't have said it if I didn't want that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So like, this is a very small example, but when that starts creeping into everywhere, all processes, going to the bank, going to like a social engagement for an RSV for a party, like these kind of things, it's just there. I remember the first time I got an invite to a party and like texting was, a thing, or social media, this massively long text of date, time, place, how to arrive there, what the cost is going to be. First of all, whoa, this party costs a lot of money. Goodness.
That like, kind of sounds like the texts you send sometimes.
Talk about conformity. And you see, and that's, by the way, I tend to throw social engagements pretty often, and for the listeners. And yeah, I definitely do that because I'm here and people are used to this. And also they will deem the quality of the party based on the invitation. How organized is this? What is all the information I need to know? And interestingly enough, for me as an individual, I think I want to know all these things in advance.
Sure.
Right. So this kind of ties back into that point of like, there's some concessions that you're going to need to make with coming to Japan, but there's also like a personality set point that you have. And if that already kind of lines up with that organizational structured part, Japan's a great fit for you. You know what I mean? So in that regard, is a great fit for me because I'm very similar, right? We need to bring it back because to your question of
the identity part,
the identity part, and like how do I view myself as like an American is, the more I experienced these like social engagements, the more I realized who I am. And especially I feel like anyone that's probably listening to this is much more cognitive of their historical, ethnical, social background from where they came, because they're not American. Countries, people of places with deep history, or even if they're not deep, long history, very strong cultural identity with pride. And that, not to say American's a very prideful place, but there's not a lot of history and you don't really know like roots and things like this. Whereas other cultures that are very, very, very deep in tradition and protective of those things, they're much more profound. So
America as an immigrant society, basically, right?
Absolutely, right?
If you can trace your lineage back 4 or 5 generations, you're in the you're not part of the greater whole of Americans, right? Like
exactly.
You're the exception to the rule, so to speak.
Exactly. And because we must is like I'm a white man, so that comes with its own special privileges, number one, and number two, experiences because of that. So not only being American, but then being a white man, never had to think about this in any significant way. So coming here and being here literally forced me, not in a bad way, but it did force me to like think about these things that I otherwise wouldn't have done if I had never left the country for sure. I traveled around quite a bit in the domestic U.S., so I had different places of reference and things like that. But that's completely different than leaving your homeland.
Sure.
Right. So yeah. So this whole idea of like, what does it mean to be an American? Very individual, very opinionated, strong, overly confident in some cases. High sense of group and tribe for your close internet circle, meaning that the people that are closest to you, you love them and you will defend them really close. But if you don't know the people, like you're like, I couldn't care less about you. These kind of things relative to other cultures where people are a little bit more openly cordial and things like that. That's my context on that.
Okay.
Also not in terms of intelligence and academics, not high on the priority list, much more on the I am the master of my own destiny. I will control my outcomes. I can do anything that I put my mind to. That whole idea, right? So I think these are just some of the things that I really came to the forefront as I started to experience this other cultural environment, which was none of those things.
A little side tangent there. You just reminded me of something that I've been getting really into recently. The idea of like correlation between IQ and then like a population grouping. Now, this kind of study, like, okay, admittedly, I haven't looked too far into it, but it seems that on average, the highest IQ countries per capita are all in Asia. So take that with a little grain of salt, though. By the way, Japan supposedly has the highest, and it's about 106, right? The United States is somewhere around like 100, I think. And then, so you take that idea that, okay, Japan has a really high average IQ. So what does that even mean? The population is very well educated? Yes, we know that. Like, statistically, quantitatively, we can prove that to be true. But then you take the other side of the coin and look at the American or the Western mentality of what you just described. It doesn't matter how smart or how dumb I am.
Right.
I am the master of my destiny, and I am going to create the world around me. I'm going to manifest, right?
Right.
And it seems to me that that is ultimately much more important, because when you're talking about testing, standardized tests, and intelligence quotas, these things are based on pattern recognition and understanding that there is an answer to a question. Whereas the Western, or particularly the American mentality, is we don't know what the answer is. Heck, we're not even sure if the question is phrased correctly. Let's just kind of be creative and flexible and try to find that answer. How do you feel about that? Like, I don't want to say that one is better than the other. I'm a little bit biased. I kind of feel like the Western way of thinking has shown itself to be more useful, but there's some pros and cons to both of these, right? And maybe that ties back to the culture and the conformity thing within Japan and so on and so forth. Sorry, another big idea that I just threw at you.
You made me, I think this will answer it, because you made me think of something as you're asking this. And I'll also bring my job into this. So by the way, I've been in human resources for the last 8 years, and also prior to that in management for 6.5. So I still had a good amount of people engagement and people development. The one question that people definitely want to know, regardless if they'll admit to it or not, for any given situation that they don't understand, is why. That is not a question that Japan teaches and encourages its citizens to engage in. That is a fundamental primary education in what we would call the West. And I think that, and I say this to bring the job into it also, is anytime I'm discussing any social conflict, interpersonal relationship issue between two people or a group, the one thing that is always missing, I should be very careful, most oftentimes missing, is the why behind a situation. And people are literally feeling a certain way because they had a misunderstanding or they made an assumption. And both of those things come from a lack of clarity around reasoning and whys. What I found is that the ethnically Japanese people who have never left Japan, or have left Japan but never experienced the non-Japanese society in a significant, meaningful way, usually it's very short, amount of time, much less than a year.
That's an important caveat for sure.
Super critical, right? So for those individuals, they struggle with admitting, well, not even admitting, some of them can't even think of why the why matters. It's not a thought for them.
Yeah.
Right? So they kind of get stuck bouncing, just spinning their wheels. And then a problem never gets solved. And a relationship might be in jeopardy because of that. So this is why I say that, to your question of which one is better between which approach is more useful, I think is the word that you used. I think that both of them have their practical applications. The Western one, because it fundamentally has this why at the core of it, I would say, I will be bold and say I believe it is superior, because and superior in the sense that it immediately feeds the need that humans crave. They must we have this propensity to understand our environment around us and what's going on in it, so that we can then either control it or exert our influence on it. So if that's missing, we're left with powerlessness in some point,
Okay.
or a significant amount of anxiety around it. So I think that in that regard, that's the one aspect of Japanese society that definitely comes through really strong. And this is why you were talking about test scores, is like, there's these patterns, there's this outcome that's like, we know there's an outcome. There's this certainty that there is a 1 or a 0, not a 0.5, right? Whereas if you're not from here, that's open to suggestion or like maybe, right? There's no maybes in Japan, right? So yeah, that's how I think about that.
Perhaps this is our working theory then for why there is some sort of like social malaise behind closed doors with a lot of Japanese folks. That necessity to be and act a certain way in public or around your superiors or whatever kind of hierarchical relationship you might find yourself in, versus what you're actually feeling but you can't express, or maybe you can't even really visualize that in your mind if you're not given those tools, or right, like you said it, they don't even know how to ask the question of why.
Right.
Obviously there are exceptions to the rule. I think the really important thing that you said there was a lot of Japanese people who spend time outside of Japan in a meaningful way, a year or so, and interact with foreign culture. They come back, and I've had conversations with such people in which they have really expressed their frustration with Japanese society. And a lot of them don't come back. A lot of them choose to stay abroad, which I think, okay, let's just put a pin on this side of the question before we move on to that next one, because I think that's a nice place to start to talk about what it means to be Japanese. But okay, how American do you think you are now? So we defined the parameters of being an American through your own interpretation.
Yeah, I think I'm very American, actually. And I think the people that know me well, regardless if especially my friends that are non-American, will say I'm very American in the sense of not just the expressions that I use in conversation, but also how my thought process, how I engage, and where I choose to spend my energies. Those, I know those are kind of vague, but I can give examples if you need to. And because of that, I'm very okay with that. I am very, one, I'm proud to be where I'm from. 2, I am thankful for the ideologies that I have and how I'm able to apply those in my life. Because I think at the end of the day, you can have a lot of pride, you can have a lot of spirit and cultural respect for where you came from. Regardless if you are in that culture or not in that culture, how you choose to live is the most important thing, because that is how people are going to see you. And relationships are everywhere. That is the core of human experience. And it is very important for you to know yourself so that you can then understand others. So I think that this whole experience of me getting to know myself through the eyes of others has been really educational. It's been super humbling. Big time. Probably the most humbling experiences of my life have been here. And also because I came here at such a young age. My adult life has been in Japan. All my significant adult firsts have been here.
Right.
It's crazy.
I'm the same way, right? I got here when I was 19, and then I stayed until I was 28, basically.
Yeah.
So, then I had a little sabbatical, but I came back, folks.
He couldn't stay away.
I think that's very revealing. Before we go on to that next part, how Japanese do you think you are?
I think it depends on the context, but yeah, when I think when the situation calls for it, I'm pretty Japanese. I think it means something when you have a lot of Japanese people say that you're more Japanese than I am. An interesting phrase, I think, by the way. But
yeah, what does it mean to be Japanese, and what does it mean to be more Japanese than someone else? I think I'm going to give a little proposition here, and I want you to develop it or deny it in certain ways. When you are able to exhibit that understanding of this cultural conformity that is expected, it's called in Japanese a unspoken understanding, right? Anmoku no ryokai. The ability to identify that and express that you identified it and understand it to a Japanese person, they're like, whoa, this person gets it. Like, we don't need to explain it, right? And that's something baked into the language as well, right? Like you don't use subjects sometimes, and then you can have entire conversations with someone and you think you're talking about the same thing, and it turns out you're not. And like, this is a problem that real Japanese people have with each other. Right?
That's
It's like, this isn't even like a foreigner speaking to a Japanese problem. This is like intercultural inter-Japanese conversations.
Interethnic issues.
There you go. Any thoughts on that? And then again, just this basic idea, what does Japanese mean?
I think I should start there. So should probably acknowledge the foreign literature that describes what it means to be Japanese, and then also what Japanese people think they are.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Again, two white guys in a room talking about what it means to be Japanese.
Right? I love it.
So, let me tell you who you are. So again, if the audience isn't familiar, so Nitobe is probably the most famous author of this. I think it's 1903. It could be 04 too, but that was the book Bushido, right? And he was Nitobe is this academic. It was commissioned by the Japanese government at the time to describe the Japanese culture. What does it mean to be Japanese? And of course, he took from the code of the samurai, right? As most people know them, right? And that was it was definitely romanticized, but it also had a lot of core values in which he would break down the essential principles of Bushido, right? Like benevolence and righteousness and like these kind of things. Those are true, but how true does a Japanese person hold them to themselves? Not just at that time, but certainly even today. I think if you would ask Japanese people today, it's like, oh, have you read Bushido? They'd be like, what are you talking about? Right?
Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about? And also, what's even more interesting is that book was written in English.
Oh.
Yes, because it was precisely for non-Japanese people. Right. So it was an active choice to push this certain identity of Japan.
And what's the type of propaganda, so to speak?
Oh, 100% propaganda. And if you know historically what was going on at the time is like they just came off the Russo-Japanese War. Right. Yeah. And they're just, this period of, what is it, 1868. So they got like a solid 40 years of open country and heavy Western influence. And we all know what happens come
a little expansionism going on.
A little expansionism going on. Us showing up at the door and be like, this is ours now. So
what was it? The Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, so to speak?
Wow. Yeah, that's I couldn't even remember what that was called.
Well, we were thinking it, right?
Thinking it. Yeah. So, so there's that idea. That's only one source. And I think also on top of that is just the other idea of this is what it means to be Japanese historically. Because Japan is a culture of 2,000 years plus of history, which not many countries can claim.
Sure.
Even Europe can't claim that much. Now we can, like England and like France is like, it's up there, but China's the only other one that even comes close to this, right? Yeah. Actually, they surpass it significantly. And because Japan, along with the rest of East Asian countries, all just funneled a whole bunch of Chinese values and culture into their own, we can't help but talk about that, right? So, there's this whole other idea of like, what does it mean, and how much do people actually identify with those big cultural values of conformity, form over function, social, personal social suppression, and ostracization in the name of the greater good.
Right, right.
So
I think you put it very well like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Those are certainly truths, and any anthropologist will immediately identify these. So I think that those kind of lay the groundwork for what the society is, and then how do those actually like manifest in daily engagements is where the shades of gray get in there, and where the opinions start to get vast.
Well, I think another thing that we should really mention here is, of course, as much of a group-oriented society Japan is, everyone is an individual, and we always have to go back to the idea versus the person versus the crowd.
You got
right?
it. Yep.
And like, I think when we're grouping these huge swaths of anybody together, we can only identify those average qualities, right, that come out as being the predominant features. Any other thoughts on the Japanese identity?
So that first part is just like kind of what exists in Japan, and then you also have the Western lens of how Japan is viewed, right? So if you take the more modern approach, probably most non-Japanese people view Japan, the country, as a whole, of this highly technologically advanced nation where there is still ninjas running around with swords.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Everyone wears a kimono, but they also have a supercomputer for some reason.
Yeah, exactly. And that image, I wonder how it maintains, like realistically. It's also that image seems to come from specific places in the Western world.
Where do you think it's mostly stemming from?
America and Britain.
Okay.
And then also to some degree in, oh my gosh, what's the name of like the Baltic areas? The people that I have encountered, this is all anecdotal, right? But the people that I've encountered from those areas have vocalized this on their own volition.
Interesting.
Yeah. So no prompting.
Yeah.
So I can't help but notice like that comes up very quickly in the conversation. So it's just like, oh wow,
the image that they
have. Yeah. So it's making me wonder. It's like, what are the media outlets that what are your inputs for this kind of thing? And because I don't hear that from other places.
You made me think of something that I've not thought so much about before, but I think it's a really important thing to throw in here. And this is a topic for a future conversation with multiple people, perhaps. But like the image of Japan from the Western perspective versus the image of Japan from the Eastern perspective.
Sure.
So like we're talking about China, Korea, but also other places like the Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam, so to speak. And you can find this information. I've looked it up before on the internet. Like, what do Vietnamese people think about Japan? And each country in Asia has their own general idea of what it means to be Japanese. And I would really like to talk to people from those countries to get their impression as well. I don't know. Have you heard anyone vocalize their thoughts on that from these places?
One of my best friends from university is Korean. And when we met, he was coming out of a stage of very close-minded, almost propaganda-focused mentality of Japan, because the old guard of Korea, as you could imagine, historically, had a very specific negative view of Japan. And he subscribed to that. He was born and raised in Korea until he was 9, and then he came to the U.S. And it was interesting because my roommate is Japanese, and the three of us became very good friends. And my other friend, my Korean friend, saw my Japanese roommate as the very first Japanese person that was different.
Gotcha.
in a positive way.
Mm.
So that was a heavy influence on him. And, so certainly, so not just from that lens to I've met people from Taiwan, in Taiwan, outside of Taiwan.
I've heard that Taiwanese have a really great image of Japan.
They in general, yes, they do. Chinese, I think it really depends on where they're from.
Yeah.
That's
been my experience as well.
Yeah, same. Yeah. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, but in general and by the way, I think it really depends on which generation we're speaking about.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
If we're talking about the millennials, they're overall pretty cool. The moment that you get into the baby boomer generation, that's when things start to get dicey. So
yeah, it's kind of a little bit shocking when I guess this goes back to the earlier part of our conversation where when you don't quite understand everything that's going on because of the language barrier, you're still learning Japanese, you're still trying to communicate with people, and then the way that people communicate with you is also altered.
Right.
And then you eventually breach that and you start to see and understand so many more things. And that's when your image of any place, I suppose, any culture that you've been adopted into changes forever. And totally. You either, I guess, assimilate entirely to that, or you have to draw your own personal line. And I think maybe this is the last topic that we can talk about here, and it kind of would tie the whole thing together. This idea of third culture. You are from your home country. You have picked up some things from your host country, and now you fall somewhere in the middle. You're no longer entirely an American. You never have been a Japanese person, despite how much they say, "Oh, you're so Japanese" when it comes to this thing.
And never will be, by the way.
Right.
In their eyes, certainly.
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole another bag of worms that we could probably have another hour conversation about.
Totally.
But so now you're in this, folks, expat group.
Yay, we're here.
Right. And in my personal experience, I have found my close childhood friends in the United States. I still communicate with them on a level that is completely unhindered by anything, right? I understand them. They understand me on a fundamental level. And we've grown up together, and I have a lot of these, not so many, but I have a few of these very close friends. No problems there. I went back to the States for a little while, about a year, and again, not too hard connecting with people, but there were some sticking points where I was like, they don't understand this idea, or they don't understand this concept. And maybe I picked it up from Japan. Maybe I just picked it up from being in the international community. But because of that, I couldn't connect with Americans entirely anymore as as a population, the average, right? And then I started realizing that I feel more comfortable and truly myself with people like you and the people that we also surround ourselves with, these expat people. And what does it mean to be an expat for you and this third culture person? And have you had a similar experience where you thought, these are my compatriots from America, but they don't get it on this one thing, and maybe they're thinking that about me too.
So I feel like there's three things in there. I'll answer the expat thing first because I think it's the simple one. I personally never viewed myself as an expat because I think there's this idea of commissioning people to perform this task. Usually. And so usually this is like an all expenses paid and we're going to take care of all this kind of stuff. That never happened for me. My company brought me over here, but literally just brought me over here. There's not this like stipend of like any of this kind of stuff. Right. So whereas all the other people that were my colleagues or my superiors in my job, that was the case for them. They never imagined themselves being in Japan. It was a fun thing to do. And I think the true thing for me, Jack, is the idea about impermanence and temporary.
Gotcha.
It's an assignment. I'm going to be here for X amount of time, usually 2 years, and then off to the next thing, right? My intention was I've set up my life to be here since I knew from 14. That was a long-term goal. I hit it at, well, to permanently live there, I hit it at 24. That's mission accomplished right there. So I didn't plan on leaving. And I think there's a big fundamental difference between that. But that's just my feeling about myself, as how I view myself as not like the expat. But if you take the other spin on that, it's like, but you're not living in your country of birth and you have a country of residence. And regardless if it's long-term or short-term, that is kind of inconsequential. So I think that expat is an appropriate term to use.
Okay, you actually just reminded me of something, a conversation I had years and years ago. What's the difference between an expat and an immigrant?
The immigrant implies, well, most of the time for the immigrants, it's an active choice, unless you're like an actual refugee or something like that. So it's about intent, usually. And then, so because of that intent, there's this implication of long-term. Right. And the expat, I really, its inception is impermanence. And that could evolve into, I'm just going to keep renewing, extend, or maybe you, even if it's not in one place, you can be an expat in multiple locations. Sure. So I think what is at the fundamental structure of that is I am going to be mobile. I intend to be somewhere that is not in my country of birth. However long I end up in those places is there, but it is this, to me, that's the idea of impermanence, because I'm jumping around a lot, or at least that's what I kind of expect, as opposed to I'm going to go to this place and I really don't plan on going anywhere after I've achieved this status of whatever. You know? So
are you an immigrant?
Definitely, right? Definitely not then, right? So, yeah. So I think in the most loose term, yes, I am an expat. I just don't view myself in the traditional structure of how people arrived here, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So going back to the way that I phrased this at the beginning, like, okay, I had this conversation a long time ago, and someone said very glibly, right, like the difference between being an expat and being an immigrant is usually expats are from the Western countries and immigrants are from the other countries. The idea being, right, like if you come from a first world country, you always have the choice of going home if you wanted to. But if you're from a developing country where your best chances of having a good life are, it doesn't have to be Japan, it could be anywhere, right? Like you plan on moving and living in that country, and that's it. Because I mean, you have family back home, but you have a better quality of life here, so it makes more sense to stay here. Then the other thing we have to ask with that question is, like, could you ever really become a Japanese person anyways? Folks, it's possible. It is possible, of course. It's very hard, and most people don't try to, because like the hurdles that you have to overcome in order to be legally defined as a Japanese national are so ridiculous. Like by the time that you do it, it's kind of just the biggest flex that you can make. Is like, yo, man, I've been here for 35 years and I still haven't gotten my Japanese nationality yet.
And it's like flexing on 5-year-olds too. Right. So it's just like, what's the point?
Yeah, exactly. Anyway.
Yeah. So no, but I think, I think that's a really great point, Jack, especially about about country of origin. People that are going to a place like Japan, if they're from a place like Syria, for example, they probably don't have an option to go back there anytime soon.
Sure.
You know what I mean? So I think that is a very important thing. However glibly that person might have stated that, yeah, that's an important thing. So that's the expat bit. The other, so like, what is the second part of like?
Oh, the third culture identity.
Oh, thank you. There it is. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I do that. I'll throw like a multi-pronged thing at you. And
no, that's good. No, usually I'm good at like remembering this, but I'm like really into the discussion here. So your experience of like you can't really mesh very well, or like this communication reservation or like lack of connectivity. However, maybe I'm not describing it accurately, but I've gone back to America many times, and I've realized that like there is a fundamental difference, and I
Mm.
get reminded why I left.
Ah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And especially now in my as I get more into midlife, I realize more and more of I must be in a certain kind of environment with people that are like-minded enough so that we can start at the same baseline,
Mm.
but diverse enough that I am mentally, emotionally, socially stimulated, because I believe that you are the sum total of the people that you're around. And if we're always trying to be a little bit better than we were yesterday,
Mm.
we need people that are going to push us and they're
Mm.
going to think differently than us. So
Mm.
that is, I definitely understand and have experienced what you've experienced. There's certain conversations, or there's certain even situations or groups of people that I actively will avoid if I go to America. There's certain conversations that I realized I can't have with people due to lack of global mindedness, lack of experience, or a very narrow-minded dancing on ignorance versus discriminatory thoughts that might be embedded that they're completely unaware of, that I would rather just not put myself in the environment because I don't want to have to be mindful of that too much.
Mm.
So
Mm-hmm.
those kind of things I became much more aware of as I've been living here. And I'll say this, like America gets a big props for its multiculturalism. Well, Tokyo pre-COVID, very multicultural
Yeah,
in
certainly.
terms of visitors, and then even the people that are still here long term. I've met people from all over the world here, and I know you have too. So like that experience in and of itself is like, hey, I don't get to meet someone from Sierra Leone very often, or
Right.
an
Yeah.
African person from Ireland. It's just like,
Mm-mm.
whoa, I met two of those people this year.
Wow.
So I'm
Wow.
just like, yeah, what I'm saying? So it's like, so from a fundamental like starting point, it's like the chances of you, especially in middle America, like not the coasts,
Yeah.
not the big cities, which is the majority of America,
Mm.
you're not going to encounter those people too often.
The other important thing to consider here is, what does it mean to look like an American? Anyone can
Okay.
be an American, right?
Who knows?
So, like when you encounter a common foreigner in Japan, you can almost like 99.9% of the time know that they're not Japanese. There are the rare exceptions where you're like, no, I was born and raised here and I am Japanese. You're like, oh, wow, okay. But most of the time, you can't just walk up to someone on the street in America and be like, where are you from? I mean, you can, but it's might be interpreted in the wrong way.
This is
Right.
I will say this though, this is that phrase right there, where are you from, is also a very American sensitivity that and my girlfriend really pointed this out because she actually asked me about this. She's British Nigerian, and that is a common question that she would be asked back in the UK, or
Right.
she would even ask, and they're literally asking, what geographically, where are you from?
Yeah.
That is a question that you could get a very different response to if you're in America, and you would certainly offend someone in some cases. So that's this idea of like hyper PC,
Right.
and from us being Americans, see, like we understand, you and I understand this, but this is a foreign concept even to like the other Western countries, which I never really thought about too much. And then also because of my job too, like extra sensitive and like PC and try to be very neutral, middle of the road with all these kind of things. So yeah, that's it. But this whole idea, I pick on this, like, where are you from kind of thing, because I think this is like I think it's very relevant to
Yeah, they say
engagement.
that the difference between, or how you can tell an American from another English speaker, so we ask the question, what is your job, or what do you do? That's the first thing that we ask.
Right.
And then if you're not American, the first thing you ask is, where are you from?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And yeah, they are seen very differently. And I found myself defaulting to, where are you from first, because that's a relevant question,
right,
to our community here. Like, okay, you're not Japanese. Well, where are you from? Like,
Right.
I'm really curious about that. I want to learn more about you, as opposed to however negatively it might be interpreted
yeah,
in our
yeah,
home country.
yeah. Yeah.
We're coming up on about an hour here. Do you have any final thoughts?
Oh goodness, I feel like there's so much. I'll answer this because I feel like I didn't really quite answer that last bit. Is like,
Sorry, yeah.
no. That's me tangenting. So the being in like that third culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
This third place. Yes, I definitely think so.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I think that's a nice place to be because you can kind of like look from this balcony and like observe the cultures as they are. Of course, you have your own biases, which you can never get rid of subjectively, subjectively, right? But I can see through this third lens now, and I think it's an advantage for me, for sure, in terms of me trying to be as objective as I can, because I think it's an ever prevalent struggle of like how can I eliminate the subjectivity and try to really just view things for what they are. It's like the people that you like. Don't judge a book by its cover. Really don't assume. You said, yeah, you can kind of tell. Yes, you probably can, but we shouldn't assume. You know, like this. That's been like a pretty big maxim of my life in like the last 2 years. So that helps me a lot, kind of mitigate that ambiguity that comes with social engagements or like corporate environment, like that kind of thing, right? So I appreciate the experiences I've had. I look forward to the ones that I'm going to have that help fuel and contribute to how does that help me view the places that I'm in, the society that I live in, and the place that I came from, and how can I like give back in some way? Like for me, the purpose of living here and where I'm at now is definitely fueled by how can I leave a lasting impression on the people that I encounter in a positive way? Like that's because there's a lot of, I don't have any social media other than Facebook, which I only post I only keep in touch with my family. Like I use Messenger to talk to my parents. It's very clear. It's Messenger, right? I don't have anything else. So all of this stuff that goes on, like in the political sphere and things like that, I am not inundated in that way by all those negative inputs. So I really try to keep those things away from me. Still stay informed of the news and stuff, right? But try to, if I'm going to have an engagement, I want it to be a positive one. And if I'm going to actively put myself in a situation, I hope that it's going to be an interesting one, right? Where if I'm going to meet someone new, cool, we get to make a new connection. Or if I don't get to meet someone new, we can reestablish something that we had, or we can further something that we've been working on, that kind of thing. So this whole idea of like, you know, we're moving forward, and it's a fun one. It's a positive one. Like, I think that message you don't get to hear about very often. So I think it's the responsibility of individuals to really make the mark where they can. And yeah, so like that idea of putting me in that third space, it helps look at two different lenses that people that are only living in one otherwise wouldn't have. So yeah, in that way, I think I'm glad that I'm in that. I don't know if it's at the top of the triangle or the bottom corner or who knows, but you know, I'm in there somewhere. That's
well, wherever it is, I think your interpretation is definitely some good advice. And I would also say mission accomplished today. Thanks so much for joining us today, Dan. Like it was a pleasurable conversation as always. I would love to have you back to continue the conversation because there's so many other things that we could talk about, and your insight was really, really fun to listen to. Thanks again. Thanks for coming on.
Right on, man. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
If you made it this far, thank you so much. I hope you found the conversation as interesting as I did. If you did enjoy the video, please remember to click the like button and subscribe to see our newer content when it comes out. If you have a story to share and you'd like to appear on Expat Lens, let me know about it. Leave a comment and head over to our Instagram page where you can message me directly. Details are in the video description. That'll do it for today. I hope to see you again soon on the next installment of Expat Lens.